we're going to talk about the structure of the ACT Math section. First of all, on the ACT Math section, there are 60 questions that you have to complete within 60 minutes. So your first math question that I'm going to give you is, how many questions do you need to average per minute? Exactly, 1 question per minute. And we'll talk about a little bit later how you can manage that time, because some questions are going to be a little bit easier than others. Some are going to be a little bit more challenging. So we'll talk about that in later sections. Also, you need to review calculator guidelines. Calculators are allowed on the math section, but they do have guidelines, and you need to check the ACT website for those particular guidelines to make sure that the one that you bring is acceptable. And finally, another thing to do ahead of time is to read the directions for this section before you take the test. The directions are about a couple of paragraphs, but that can eat away at your precious time that we had just talked about, that 60 minutes that you have. So if you'll get a practice test like we have within our resource library and take a look at those directions, they would be very similar, if not the same, to what you'll see on the actual test. So take a look at that before time. Now, what are the math subjects that are covered on the ACT Math? Mainly your questions are going to come through subjects that you have had through Algebra 2, and that's assuming that you've already taken geometry. So we're talking about pre-algebra material, Algebra 1, geometry, and Algebra 2. There will be a little bit of trig that hopefully you will have received within your Algebra 2 class, so it's really not necessary that you've even had pre-calculus or calculus. Most of those topics will not be on the ACT. And so what we're talking about specifically is like your pre-algebra, elementary algebra, intermediate algebra. Geometry problems are broken down into coordinate and plane, and then the trigonometry like we just talked about. Now for the 2016-17 school year, the ACT board made some changes to the reporting categories in the math section. And as you can see from this chart here, they have divided the question content up just a little bit. All the questions still contain the material like we talked about in the previous slide, the algebra, the geometry, the trig, but in terms of how they report and categorize the questions, that has changed somewhat. So what they have done, they have several different categories. The first one is integrating essential skills. And as you can see from our pie chart, that ranges from about 40 to 43% of the questions. The integrating essential skills category covers questions from material that you were presented prior to 8th grade in most cases. So it's going to be your basic mathematical concepts. You may see things like fractions, percents, things like that, things that you have done prior to 8th grade, and that's 40 to 43% of the test questions. The next major category section is labeled Preparing for Higher Math. Now within there are 5 different categories, including numbers and quantity, algebra, functions, geometry, and statistics and probability. Now this is going to include material that you've pretty much gained from Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry, those sort of classes. And they're going to be questions that are a little bit more in depth than the ones that you would have seen from the integrating essential skills. And you can see how those are broken up fairly evenly for the most cases. Now, what we've seen in the last couple of ACT tests that have been offered have been a little bit more of an emphasis on the statistics and probability section than what we've seen in the past. So that is an area that we are trying to beef up in our training so that you will be prepared for that. But it's a lot of the same questions. There's not really a change in content. It's just how these categories are reported in your answer sheets and how they categorize the questions themselves. Now, they've also created another category of modeling, and that's going to be in greater than 25% of your total questions. So, within the integrating essential skills and the preparing for higher math classes, greater than 25% of those questions will contain some type of modeling aspect to it. It's going to be a little bit more than just asking to, let's say, arrange fractions from least to greatest or solve some particular equation. It's going to be using those skills in answering some type of question, really making you have to really think and know the concept so that you can apply that in some aspect in making maybe even a decision or figuring something out like that. So that's really why it's going to be so important to really know these skills and not just memorize something to learn for a test. Now, what types of problems can you expect to see? The questions are all multiple choice, and we have 5 choices: A, B, C, D, and E, or F, G, H, J, K. You're going to see word problems, solve and simplify questions. There's going to be graphs that you may have to interpret or look at, figures to evaluate. And usually the test begins with easier questions and we move on to the more challenging questions. But in saying that, you could have one of these integrating essential skills, one of these questions that contains material that you were probably presented before 8th grade at the end of the test. So you have to pace yourself throughout the entire test. Now, how can you prepare for this test? The biggest thing we think you can do is to review problems, just like we have in this course. See what kind of example problems we have that are based on real ACT problems. You need to work problems, not just watch someone else work them, but you need to put pencil to paper and work the problems yourself. Get that experience. And you're going to also have to review and know certain formulas. And you gain all this experience and preparation by practicing, and practicing some more.